Cars come with all kinds of bells and whistles these days, from heated seats all the way up to autonomous driving.
Consumer Reports rarely shouts. For decades, the organisation has built its reputation on careful testing, quiet analysis, and cautious conclusions. When they call out a problem, people listen. But in late 2025, their tone changed dramatically. No longer a quiet warning buried in footnotes, their message was closer to a flare shot into the night sky. America's car market is unraveling, here and now. This was not about minor fluctuations in sales figures or a single bad quarter for a particular brand. According to their report, the US automotive industry is sliding towards something much more dramatic, a structural collapse with ripples that reach every household, every factory, and every trading floor. The warning, stark as it was, pointed to three forces converging in dangerous ways: sharply rising interest rates, ongoing supply chain breakdowns, and a consumer base rapidly shifting away from traditional gasoline-powered vehicles. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this, and if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now onto the video. On the surface, car dealerships still look busy. Advertising remains glossy, new models continue rolling off production lines, and electric vehicle launches are promoted with fanfare. But behind the marketing veneer, something far darker is taking shape. Sales declines are creeping toward double digits, showroom traffic has slowed to a crawl, and financial analysts are quietly downgrading their projections. Consumer Reports summed it up bluntly. The structural weaknesses are no longer hidden. They are in plain sight. But their report also hinted at something more unsettling. The numbers already available, painful as they looked, were only the opening act of a much darker performance. Buried beneath official statistics were deeper fractures in the market, cracks that could widen rapidly. And if they did, the consequences would stretch far beyond the car lots of Detroit or the auto plants of Ohio. They could reach into mortgages, credit approvals, grocery bills, and even the stability of entire communities. So how did the world's second-largest car market, once seen as a pillar of American strength, arrive at this precarious moment? And who stands to gain, or lose, as the system trembles? To answer, we must trace the story across 10 chapters, each unfolding like dominoes tipping into the next. What begins as unaffordable car loans will soon spill into financial markets, factory floors, family kitchens, and eventually, the very definition of car ownership itself. Consumer Reports is not in the business of drama. For decades, the non-profit watchdog has been the most trusted name in product testing, evaluating everything from toasters to Teslas. Its conclusions carry weight precisely because they are careful, measured, and often conservative. Yet history shows they have an uncanny ability to sense market shifts before others. In the mid-2000s, they predicted the hybrid boom before Toyota's Prius sales exploded. A decade later, they warned about diesel engine emissions long before the Volkswagen scandal erupted worldwide. This track record makes their latest proclamation all the more alarming. Their 2025 report declared that the US auto market was teetering toward collapse, not years down the road, but in the present tense. They identified three converging forces creating the perfect storm. First, sharply rising interest rates had pushed car loans into territory unseen since the early 2000s. Second, supply chain breakdowns, worsened by global shipping bottlenecks and semiconductor shortages, left dealers with mismatched inventories. Third, and perhaps most threatening of all, American consumers were shifting rapidly away from gasoline-powered cars, but automakers were still overproducing them. According to their data, year-over-year sales declines were approaching double digits in certain vehicle categories between 2024 and 2025. Even luxury brands, once insulated from downturns, were seeing empty showrooms in major metro areas. The watchdog's language was blunt. The market's structural weaknesses are in plain sight. For an organisation known for understatement, this amounted to shouting. But Consumer Reports went further, hinting at unreported weaknesses beneath official statistics. They suggested that some automakers were downplaying unsold inventory, extending dealer loans artificially, and offering quiet subsidies to mask softening demand. If true, the official data may already understate the crisis. The organisation's warning was met with scepticism from some industry executives who claimed that cyclical downturns were normal. Yet the scale of the warning, and its timing, rattled many on Wall Street and in Washington. Veteran analysts noted that Consumer Reports had never before described the market as on the brink. Their cautionary words landed in a climate already anxious about inflation, rising interest rates, and consumer debt. The chilling question was no longer whether the American car market faced challenges. That much was obvious. The real question was how deep the cracks went and how quickly they could widen into something irreversible. Consumer reports framed the crisis as immediate and systemic. That language carried echoes of other collapses in American memory: the housing bubble of 2008, the dot-com crash of 2000, the oil crisis of the 1970s. When trusted forecasters start drawing such parallels, people take notice. And indeed, just days after the report's release, signs emerged that the first domino had already tipped. Sales figures from dealerships across the Midwest showed dramatic declines. Financing applications were being rejected at record rates, and consumers, the lifeblood of any market, were beginning to walk away in numbers too large to ignore. For decades, the American dream of buying a new car every few years was not just a symbol of mobility, but of middle-class stability. Families would trade in older vehicles for newer models, dealerships would eagerly negotiate financing, and automakers could count on a steady stream of demand. But in 2025, that cycle has been broken. The culprit? Interest rates that have climbed so high that millions of Americans can no longer even qualify for financing, let alone afford the payments. Just 2 years ago, a new car loan could often be secured at under 4%. That rate, manageable for most households, meant that a mid-priced sedan or compact SUV came with a monthly payment of around $400. Today, the picture looks very different. Thanks to the Federal Reserve's aggressive rate hikes, auto loan interest rates have surged into territory not seen since the early 2000s. Buyers now face 7%, 8%, or even 9% interest rates, numbers that push a once manageable $400 payment into the $600 and $700 range. For a working-class family already struggling with stagnant wages, rising grocery bills, and higher housing costs, that extra $200 or $300 per month is enough to derail the purchase entirely. Banks and credit unions are also tightening their lending standards as default rates tick upward. This means that it is not just a matter of payments being too high. Millions of applicants are being rejected before they ever get the chance to sign on the dotted line. Loan rejection rates are climbing fastest among younger buyers and first-time car owners, leaving them priced out of the market altogether. The irony is striking. Even as automakers flood advertisements with glossy campaigns, the pool of actual eligible buyers is shrinking. Consumer Reports highlights the emotional toll behind these statistics. In Ohio, a middle-class couple who had saved for years to replace their decade-old SUV walked away from the dealership in tears. The financing quote they received was hundreds more per month than they had expected. Their story is not unique. Across the country, families who once relied on predictable financing options are finding themselves clinging to vehicles long past their prime, hoping they can squeeze out another few years of use. For dealerships, the change is devastating. Appointment books that were once full are now empty. Sales staff are cutting hours, morale is low, and the once frenzied showroom atmosphere has turned into an eerie quiet. The long-term consequences are profound. A shrinking buyer base means shrinking trade-ins, fewer new vehicles on the road, and ultimately, a destabilised auto economy. As buyers disappear, automakers are left with growing inventories of unsold cars. The ripple effects move outward. Mechanics see more demand as older vehicles stay in service longer. Parts suppliers struggle to keep up with replacement needs, and financing institutions adjust their models to reflect greater credit risk. But most importantly, the erosion of affordability erodes confidence. When the average American begins to believe that buying a car is no longer realistic, the cultural and economic underpinnings of the entire industry begin to crumble. What was once routine, financing a family sedan, now feels out of reach. And as wallets snap shut, the consequences are not confined to households. They spill directly into the supply chains and balance sheets of the automakers themselves. Walk onto a dealership lot in 2025, and you'll no longer find the empty asphalt that dominated headlines during the height of supply chain shortages in the pandemic years. Instead, you'll find rows of gleaming SUVs, oversized trucks, and luxury trim models, vehicles that, just a few years ago, would have flown off the lot in weeks. Today, they sit for months, unsold, their glossy paint gathering dust in the sun. At first glance, this might look like a healthy recovery. The lots are full again, shipments are arriving, and shelves are not bare. But the reality is far more troubling. Supply chain disruptions have not vanished, they've evolved. Instead of broad shortages affecting all types of vehicles, the bottlenecks have created a bizarre mismatch. The cars that buyers want most, affordable compact cars, hybrids, and fuel-efficient crossovers, are the very models that remain scarce. They vanish within days of arrival, sometimes before they even hit the lot. Meanwhile, the models in oversupply are the ones buyers are least able to afford: large SUVs, fully loaded pickups, and luxury sedans. This mismatch is not just frustrating, it's expensive. Dealers are forced to slash prices on the unwanted models, offering steep discounts that eat into already thin profit margins. At the same time, bidding wars erupt for the few efficient, affordable cars available. Some buyers place deposits months in advance just to secure a hybrid, only to see delivery dates delayed repeatedly. Manufacturers, meanwhile, remain trapped by production cycles planned years in advance. Retooling assembly lines to produce more of what buyers actually want is not something that can be done overnight. Shifting from an oversized SUV to a compact hybrid requires months of planning, new parts, new contracts, and in some cases, entirely different factories. One Texas dealer described the dilemma vividly. In a single month, 3 shipments of large SUVs arrived at his lot, each more expensive than the last. Yet at the same time, he had a wait list dozens of names long for compact hybrids that never arrived. Customers grew frustrated, some walking away not just from the wait list but from the dealership altogether. He summed it up: "We're drowning in vehicles nobody can afford while starving for the ones everyone wants." This imbalance is starting to reshape corporate strategies. Automakers that once leaned heavily on big trucks and SUVs, the very vehicles that generated the highest margins, are being forced to rethink their production priorities. For Wall Street, this is a red flag. Investors are not just worried about current sales, they are worried about the industry's ability to pivot fast enough to changing consumer demands. The image of lots full of unsold vehicles, once symbols of unstoppable demand, now represents inefficiency and strategic miscalculation. Discount wars are breaking out in some regions as dealers desperate to move large inventory/prices by thousands of dollars. Elsewhere, customers are being told to wait months or even years for the vehicles they want. The result is a market that looks healthy from a distance but feels broken up close. It is a system misaligned with its customers, bleeding money on the wrong models and straining against its own inertia. Even before the average American fully understood what was happening in showrooms, investors had already begun to react. Stock prices for major automakers, once stable or rising, began to tumble. In a matter of weeks, some shares slid by double digits, wiping billions from market valuations. Consumer Reports' warning had shaken confidence, but it was the subsequent data, falling sales, rising loan defaults, mismatched inventories, that sparked genuine fear. For Wall Street, the question is not just about quarterly earnings. It is about long-term viability. Analysts are downgrading companies not simply because they sold fewer cars this quarter, but because their entire product strategy appears out of step with reality. Automakers who bet heavily on oversized SUVs or premium electric vehicles are now vulnerable. Sales are stalling, reliability scores are slipping, and consumer loyalty is fading. The Detroit Giants, once considered too big to fail, are suddenly looking fragile. The impact is not limited to automakers themselves. Supplier firms, from tyre manufacturers to semiconductor producers, are also taking heavy hits. These companies depend on large, predictable contracts from automakers. When those contracts are delayed, scaled back, or cancelled outright, suppliers' revenues plummet. For smaller firms, a single lost contract can mean layoffs or bankruptcy. Investors know this, and they are selling aggressively. One hedge fund manager described the mood in eerily familiar terms. "It feels like the months before the housing crash," he said. "On the surface, things still looked okay. Showrooms had cars, factories were humming, but insiders had already started pulling out. That kind of quiet, accelerated retreat can turn a slowdown into a collapse as panic selling feeds on itself. Market volatility is now routine. Shares of once stable companies swing wildly on rumours of plant closures, production delays, or disappointing sales figures. For investors, the calculation is brutally simple. Why risk holding stock in a sector that appears to be shrinking when other industries, technology, defence, energy, offer safer returns? The sell-off is not just hurting automakers' reputations, it is limiting their ability to raise capital for the very investments they need to survive. Behind trading screens, the panic may look like numbers in red, but on the factory floor, the consequences are all too real. Declining stock values pressure companies to cut costs quickly, often through layoffs or plant shutdowns. Those decisions ripple outward, hitting workers, families, and communities. The market may be reacting to future risks, but in doing so, it accelerates present pain. The collapse, in other words, is not just a matter of consumer demand. It is a confidence crisis. Once investors lose faith in an industry's future, the decline becomes self-fulfilling. And as Wall Street panicked, the silence on America's factory floors was about to tell an even darker story. On Wall Street, the collapse of automaker stock prices may have been measured in percentages and lost billions. But in factory towns across Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky, the crisis was measured in something far more personal: silence. The hum of machinery, once the steady heartbeat of entire communities, has slowed to a whisper or stopped altogether. For workers, the sound of silence is not peace. It is a warning that their livelihoods are in jeopardy. As sales figures declined and investor confidence eroded, automakers responded with brutal efficiency, cost-cutting measures, layoffs, and production slowdowns. In the past 12 months alone, more than 30,000 jobs tied directly to the auto sector have been cut or furloughed. Entire shifts are being sent home early. Plants that once ran around the clock now sit dark for weeks at a time. In some cases, entire sections of assembly lines are covered in tarps, idle machinery standing as silent reminders of a market in retreat. Lordstown, Ohio, tells the story most vividly. Once famous for its sprawling General Motors plant, the city had experienced the devastating blow of a total closure several years ago, only to be buoyed when part of the facility reopened with promises of new investment. But now, those hopes are fading again. Workers describe stretches of inactivity, interrupted shifts, and growing uncertainty about whether the plant will survive another year. A veteran union member with 27 years on the job summarised the mood bluntly. "I thought my grandkids would see this plant running. Now I'm not so sure." The collapse is not limited to one region. In Kentucky, Ford has cut shifts at a truck plant that once represented one of the state's largest private employers. In Michigan, Stellantis has announced rotating furloughs, leaving thousands of families struggling to make ends meet. Even suppliers are not immune. Factories producing tyres, electronics, and metal parts that feed into the automakers' supply chains are scaling back as orders vanish. For younger workers, the downturn is a shattering first encounter with the instability of the industry. Many had entered the auto sector believing it was a stable path to middle-class security, only to find themselves out of work months after starting. For older employees, the moment is grimly familiar, a repeat of cycles they thought had ended. Either way, the result is the same: shrinking paychecks, growing anxiety, and communities bracing for impact. In the parking lots outside these factories, conversations are short and subdued. Workers share rumours about which plants might close next, discuss whether to seek other jobs, and wonder how long unemployment benefits will last if the closures spread. The sense of solidarity that has long defined America's auto workers is still present, but it is now laced with deep uncertainty. The factory floor has always been more than a workplace. It is the foundation of schools, local businesses, and small-town economies. When the assembly line slows, everything else in the community slows too. And this time, the slowdown was not just about cars, it was about survival. Workers knew the next step was coming, and it would not be quiet. It would be loud, public, and unavoidable. As plants slowed and layoffs spread, another confrontation erupted: strikes. Across the nation, from Detroit's city blocks to the gates of southern assembly plants, workers gathered in rows with signs, chanting in unison. Bundled against the wind, they stood shoulder to shoulder demanding job security, fair wages, and guarantees for their future, in an industry that seemed increasingly unstable. The strikes were not isolated protests. They became a movement, tapping into anxieties far beyond the auto sector itself. The conflict was fueled by more than falling sales. Workers had been growing restless for years as automakers aggressively pursued electric vehicle production. Union leaders argued that the transition to EVs was being used as cover for deep cuts in traditional manufacturing roles. Plants once dedicated to building internal combustion engines were being phased out. Retraining programs promised by executives were either delayed, underfunded, or non-existent. For many employees, the future seemed to hold fewer jobs, lower pay, and less stability. The spark came in the form of multiple labour actions over the course of a single year. At least 4 major strikes disrupted production lines, with some lasting days and others stretching into weeks. Each strike cost automakers hundreds of millions of dollars in lost output. But for workers, it was about more than money. It was about dignity, survival, and the fear of being left behind in a rapidly changing industry. One Midwestern SUV plant became the emblem of the movement. A mix of seasoned union members and younger hires marched side by side, holding signs that read, "Our jobs, our future." Passing cars honked in solidarity. Families brought food to the picket lines. The strike turned into a rallying point not only for auto workers, but for workers in other industries facing similar uncertainty. Truck drivers, warehouse staff, and even teachers showed up in support, turning the protest into community events. Management, meanwhile, insisted that compromise was necessary. Executives pointed to the financial strain caused by declining sales, warning that wage increases and job guarantees could push companies further toward collapse. They argued that restructuring was necessary for survival, but the mistrust ran too deep. Workers saw executive bonuses still being paid, new EV factories being announced overseas, and shareholders protected while employees bore the brunt of the downturn. The result was gridlock. Strikes dragged on, production losses mounted, and automakers grew increasingly desperate to bring workers back to the table. Yet the anger on the ground was too raw. For many workers, these demonstrations represented their last stand against a system that seemed willing to discard them in the name of progress. The strikes highlighted a profound truth. The collapse of the auto industry was not just an economic story, but a human one. Behind every production delay and every unsold car was a worker worried about feeding their family, paying their mortgage, or putting their kids through school. And as the strikes dragged on, another crisis was brewing. This one not on the factory floor, but in the homes of ordinary Americans struggling just to afford transportation. For most Americans, the crisis in the auto industry was felt not in boardrooms or on picket lines, but at the dealership and the repair shop. The sticker shock was undeniable. The median price of a new vehicle had surged past $48,000, an unthinkable figure just a decade ago. Even the used car market, once a refuge for budget-conscious buyers, was averaging more than $27,000 per vehicle. For many families, those numbers were insurmountable. The problem was not just the upfront cost. Financing compounded the pain. With interest rates near 8% or 9%, monthly payments for mid-range vehicles soared past $600. Insurance premiums, already climbing nationwide, added to the burden. Gasoline prices remained volatile, while electric vehicle charging infrastructure was still uneven, limiting options. For households trying to budget carefully, the conclusion was simple. Buying a car was no longer possible. Instead, families held onto their vehicles longer than ever. Where once Americans might have replaced cars every 5 to 7 years, now they were stretching ownership to a decade or more. Dealerships saw fewer trade-ins. Mechanics saw a surge in demand for repairs and maintenance. The average age of vehicles on US roads reached record highs, and with that came higher repair needs. But even here, buyers found no relief. Parts shortages, already a problem during the pandemic, had returned with a vengeance. Electronic modules, advanced driver assistance sensors, and high-voltage battery packs were back-ordered for months. A small-town mechanic in Iowa described how he had a customer's pickup truck sitting lifeless for 3 months, waiting for a single part that simply could not be sourced. "I've checked every distributor, called across state lines, even tried online auctions," he said. Nothing. The customer, unable to work without the truck, was relying on neighbours for rides while the shop lost thousands in potential revenue. Repair costs climbed sharply as a result. A job that once cost $800 could now approach $1,200, if the part could even be found. Small garages struggled to compete with larger chains for scarce inventory. Some closed entirely, unable to sustain months of lost business. For consumers, the wait times and rising prices meant that even the fallback option of keeping an old car running was becoming less reliable. The cycle was vicious. High new car prices pushed buyers into the used market. High used car prices pushed them into repair shops. Parts shortages turned repairs into months-long ordeals. And all the while, costs continued to climb. What had once been the backbone of American independence, the ability to drive, was now becoming a luxury that many could no longer afford. The psychological shift was equally profound. For decades, owning a car was a milestone of adulthood, a symbol of freedom and opportunity. Now it was a source of stress, anxiety, and financial strain. And as families struggled to hold on to aging cars, Detroit itself was being forced to rewrite its future, a rewrite that would send shockwaves through the entire industry. For years, the big three automakers, General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, mapped out their future with glossy presentations, confident timelines, and bold promises. By the early 2030s, executives said, dozens of new electric models would be rolling off production lines, heralding a new era of American automotive leadership. But in 2025, those grand ambitions are colliding with cold reality. Declining sales, high borrowing costs, and warnings from analysts have forced Detroit to rip up its carefully scripted plans and rewrite its future on the fly. Inside boardrooms once filled with excitement over innovation, the mood is now grim. Executives no longer discuss expansion with enthusiasm, they talk about survival with unease. Presentation decks, once designed to inspire investors, are replaced by crisis memos and damage control briefings. The urgency is palpable. Every decision feels like a gamble. Cut too much, and the company loses relevance. Cut too little, and it risks financial ruin. Ford has already announced delays for 2 of its highly anticipated electric models, citing market readiness concerns. General Motors, which once prided itself on an aggressive all-EV future, has quietly scaled back output at one of its flagship EV plants, redirecting resources toward hybrid vehicles. Stellantis, meanwhile, has paused development of a compact EV line intended for North America, shifting engineers toward more profitable global projects. Behind these moves lies an unspoken admission: the surge in electric vehicle demand that once electrified the market has cooled. Early adopters embraced EVs, but high sticker prices, uneven charging infrastructure, and lingering reliability concerns have made mainstream buyers hesitant. The dream of a seamless transition from gasoline to electric has become a winding road of compromises. This pivot is as much about survival as it is about strategy. Automakers cannot afford to build cars no one is buying, but by scaling back their electric ambitions, they risk ceding ground to smaller, more nimble rivals. Korean and Chinese automakers are seizing this moment, flooding the market with cheaper hybrids and compact EVs that undercut American models by thousands of dollars. For Detroit, the retreat is painful. For years, the Big Three positioned themselves as leaders of the future. Now, they find themselves scrambling just to keep pace. The very narrative of American innovation, once a point of pride, is being rewritten in real time. And while the Big Three hesitate, rivals are charging forward. As Detroit scaled back, foreign competitors surged ahead. South Korea's Hyundai and Kia, along with China's BYD, saw an opportunity and seized it with precision. Their strategy was simple but devastatingly effective. Offer practical, affordable hybrids and EVs priced thousands below comparable American vehicles, while ensuring production lines stayed nimble and efficient. The results were striking. Within just 12 months, Korean brands increased their share of the US market by more than 3 percentage points. A seismic shift in an industry where fractions of a point usually take years to gain. Showrooms for these brands buzzed with activity. Test drives were fully booked, orders poured in, and customers who once swore loyalty to Detroit brands were driving off in foreign nameplates instead. BYD, in particular, became a standout. With vertically integrated manufacturing that included its own battery plants, the Chinese automaker avoided many of the supply chain snarls plaguing its American counterparts. Its vehicles arrived faster, often cheaper, and with fewer delays. Fleet sales and niche dealer partnerships allowed BYD to establish a foothold in markets where American EVs were struggling. Hyundai and Kia focused on hybrids, a segment often overlooked by Detroit in its push toward all-electric futures. By offering fuel-efficient models that didn't require charging infrastructure, they appealed directly to budget-conscious buyers nervous about high EV prices and limited charging networks. The strategy worked. Customers who once dismissed foreign brands as secondary were now lining up for them, citing affordability, reliability, and availability as deciding factors. This shift didn't go unnoticed in Washington. Lawmakers, alarmed by the erosion of domestic market share, began debating protective measures. Proposals for tariffs, subsidies, and tax incentives flooded congressional hearings. One camp argued that shielding Detroit from foreign competition was essential to protect American jobs. Another warned that protectionism would only raise prices further for consumers already struggling. Behind the policy debates, one fact was clear. The American auto industry's dominance was slipping, and rivals were rewriting the playbook. The narrative was no longer about Detroit leading the world. It was about Detroit fighting to keep up. If Detroit's retreat was painful, Rivian's collapse was catastrophic. Once hailed as the bold startup that would challenge Tesla head-on, Rivian embodied the hopes of a new generation of electric automakers. Backed by billions in funding, it promised rugged designs, cutting-edge technology, and a loyal customer base. But by 2025, those promises had crumbled into a sobering lesson about overreach. Quarterly losses ballooned into the billions, with revenue falling far short of even modest projections. Dealership lots that once bustled with eager customers began to resemble ghost towns. Rows of unsold Rivian trucks and SUVs sat baking under the sun. Service bays, too, grew quiet. Fewer new owners meant fewer maintenance appointments, compounding the sense of decline. In the span of just 6 months, Rivian was forced to close or idle 3 assembly facilities, leaving thousands of workers unemployed. Dealership partners who had invested heavily in new showrooms and service centres now faced financial ruin. Some considered shutting down entirely, unable to survive on the trickle of foot traffic. The brand's reputation, once tied to innovation and reliability, was now plagued by delays, recalls, and quality complaints. Financial analysts pointed to Rivian's rapid expansion as a fatal mistake, a gamble on endless growth in a market that was cooling fast. Competition from both established brands and agile newcomers squeezed them from all sides. For consumers, Rivian's fall was a harsh reminder that even well-funded startups are not immune to brutal market forces. For the industry, it was a flashing red warning. Misreading the moment can be lethal. Rivian's collapse sent shockwaves through suppliers, investors, and policymakers alike, underscoring how quickly fortunes can change in an industry already under strain. Out of crisis often comes reinvention, and the US auto industry is already showing signs that its future will look radically different from its past. With sales collapsing, factories slowing, and rivals surging, automakers are being forced to rethink the very concept of car ownership. Subscription-based models, where customers pay monthly fees for flexible access to vehicles, are gaining traction. Shared mobility platforms are expanding, blending rideshare, rentals, and fleets into integrated services. For consumers, this could mean a permanent break from the tradition of buying and holding a personal car for years. Urban residents may rely entirely on subscription fleets, while rural buyers could see modular, upgradable vehicles designed to last decades. Electric vehicles, while facing short-term demand headwinds, remain central to long-term strategies as infrastructure slowly expands. But one truth is unavoidable. The collapse has exposed inefficiencies the industry can no longer afford to ignore. The era of unchecked growth, endless consumer demand, and guaranteed profits is over. What replaces it is still uncertain. For now, the auto industry teeters on the edge of transformation, caught between decline and reinvention. Consumer Reports was right to sound the alarm. The collapse is not coming. It is here. And as the industry struggles to adapt, the only guarantee is that the car you once knew is gone. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.